So let's get to the facts. The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon, that the United States undercut its allies and secretly violated American policy against trafficking with terrorists. Those charges are utterly false. The United States has not made concessions to those who hold our people captive in Lebanon, and we will not. The United States has not swapped boatloads of plane loads of American weapons for the return of American hostages, and we will not. Other reports have surfaced alleging U.S. involvement. Reports of a sea lift to Iran using Danish ships to carry American arms, of vessels in Spanish ports being employed in secret U.S. arms shipments, of Italian ports being used, of the U.S. spending or sending spare parts and weapons for combat aircraft. All these reports are quite exciting, but as far as we're concerned, not one of them is true.
The charge that President Reagan personally knew of the plan to divert profits from Iranian arms sales to Contra rebels in Nicaragua was refuted today at the congressional hearings into the so-called Iran-Contra affair. The former National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, said that the buck stopped with him and that he'd made a very deliberate decision not to ask the president for his approval. Admiral Poindexter explained that he wanted to give the president the option of what he called plausible deniability.
With this history in mind, we were receptive last year when we were alerted to the possibility of establishing a direct dialogue with Iranian officials. Now let me repeat, America's long-standing goals in the region have been to help preserve Iran's independence from Soviet domination, to bring an honorable end to the bloody Iran-Iraq war, to halt the export of subversion and terrorism in the region. A major impediment to those goals has been an absence of dialogue, a cutoff in communication between us. It's because of Iran's strategic importance and its influence in the Islamic world that we chose to probe for a better relationship between our countries.
However, he did say that Mr. Reagan approved weapons sales to Iran strictly as an arms for hostages deal. So far, the president has claimed that arms deals were not started as a trade for hostages, but instead to win over moderate forces in Iran. Tonight, the White House spokesman Marlon Fitzwalter said the president felt gratified at having his statements on the diversion of funds to the Contras confirmed. As for trading arms for hostages, the president apparently cannot recall either seeing or signing a document approving that deal. He does not, however, dispute the contention that he did so.
Let me repeat, our interests are clearly served by opening a dialogue with Iran and thereby helping to end the Iran-Iraq war. That war has dragged on for more than 6 years with no prospect of a negotiated settlement. The slaughter on both sides has been enormous, and the adverse economic and political consequences for that vital region of the world have been growing.
Throughout the conduct of my entire tenure at the National Security Council, I assumed that the President was aware of what I was doing and had, through my superiors, approved it. On or about Friday, November 21st, I asked Admiral Poindexter directly, does the President know? He told me he did not.
The implication of North's testimony was that there were only two explanations. Either Poindexter and the late CIA Director William Casey were in some kind of a conspiracy with the president to pursue a covert foreign policy, or Poindexter and Casey were in a conspiracy to keep the president in the dark. It is this stark choice which has transfixed Washington for months. And if Poindexter did not tell the president, why not? Poindexter first described how Oliver North came to him in February 1986 with his neat idea to take money from the Ayatollah and use it to finance the Contras.
He said something to the effect that, Admiral, I think I have found a way that we can legally provide some funds to the democratic resistance through funds that will accrue from the arms sales to the Iranians. To make a long story short, in the end, I thought it was a very good idea at the end of this conversation, and I personally approved it.
Did he ask you for your approval?
I don't recall how he phrased his request, but he was clearly looking for a signal from me whether or not to proceed ahead along this line.
And you gave it.
And I gave it to him. I
And
personally
Mr.
did.
Chairman,
If Poindexter had given North approval, did he then go and seek his own authorization for this major foreign policy initiative from his superior, President Reagan? This led to the crucial question of the whole scandal.
Although I was convinced that we could properly do it and that the president would approve if asked, I made a very deliberate decision not to ask the president so that I could insulate him from the decision and provide some future deniability for the president if it ever leaked out. Of course, our hope was that it would not leak out.
And so that the answer is you did not tell the President of the United States.
I did not.
And that for a period of whatever it is, 9 months, you kept it from the President of the United States for the reasons you've given.
Mr. Lyman, this clearly was an important decision, but it was also an implementation of very clear policy. If the president had asked me, I very likely would have told him about it, but he didn't, and I think it's, you know, an important point here is that on this whole issue, you know, the buck stops here with me. I made the decision. I felt that I had the authority to do it. I thought it was a good idea. I was convinced that the president would, in the end, think it was a good idea. But I did not want him to be associated with the decision.
We already know from North's testimony that the CIA director, Bill Casey, also knew about the diversion of funds from the very start. So Poindexter was asked, had he ever discussed the subject with Mr. Casey? Had they together conspired not to tell the president?
Did you ever discuss with Mr. Casey the diversion?
I did not.
Why not?
Because I wanted to keep the issue highly compartmented. As I said and have testified before this morning, to my knowledge, Colonel North and I were the only ones that knew about it. Mr. Casey had to come up to the Hill to testify before the intelligence committees, and I did not want him to have to be evasive in answering questions.
We now know that in answering those congressional questions, Director Casey was more than evasive. He lied. There did come a point, however, when Admiral Poindexter was tempted to tell the president about the policy being carried out in his name.
That he says, look, I don't want to pull out our support for the Contras for any reason. This would be an unacceptable option. Isn't there something that I could do unilaterally? And by that, I took it to mean that he could do on his own that didn't require congressional approval. And I was sorely tempted at that point to tell him what we had working, but I thought better of it and did not.
And that was because you realized this would be so controversial.
That's correct.
So that again, it's the more controversial the issue, the less the president was to be told.
I'm going to object.
so that we could assist in bringing about a ceasefire and eventually a settlement. We have sought to be even-handed by working with both sides and with other interested nations, prevent a widening of the war. This sensitive undertaking has entailed great risk for those involved. There is no question but that we could never have begun or continued this dialogue had the initiative been disclosed earlier.
The drug that had a stranglehold on the city, its neighborhoods, and many of its people. Since that time, police have raided more drug dens, confiscated more guns and money, arrested more dealers than ever before. Now,
Ed, they call crack freebasing. It's not like what Richard Pryor used to do, purifying cocaine with volatile chemicals. Crack is smoking a less volatile, ready-made product that is far from pure. But crack is only a symptom of a much larger problem, the new age of drugs. Drugs that all have one thing in common. They're more frightening than anything we've ever seen.
It is so intense. I can't even describe it. It's the best. It really is.
Okay, to begin, it's Robert, how do you spell your last name?
S-T-U-T-M-A-N.
And your title?
Special Agent in Charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration for New York.
Hearing a lot, first I want to start off hearing a lot about crack, and all these reports, are they overblown? Are they exaggerated? Is this as much of a problem as we're being led to believe?
It's an interesting question. I got transferred here 6 months ago, and one of the first briefings I got from my staff in New York was on crack. And my original conception, I remember it very clearly, was this is a fad that may be being overblown. I've completely turned around in the past 6 months. I think it is very close to becoming the drug of choice in New York, but I think more importantly, because of the reasons it has become the drug of choice in New York, I think we are in a position of in the near future, it is going to become one of the drugs of choice in the United States.
Good evening. A day of surveillance by the Leon County Sheriff's Department paid off with a crack cocaine bust tonight. The raid at Bennett's grocery store on Georgia Street yielded about 2 ounces of large crack cocaine granules and $2,000 in cash. Arrested is 29-year-old William Matthews of Harlem Street. He's known on the street as Baby Boy. Investigators say the drug was sold openly to all comers.
Was my girl.
These recovering addicts say they ended up spending more on cheap raw cocaine than pure cocaine because smoking the drug is so addictive they didn't know when to stop. Yes. Unlike other drugs they've used over the years, crack destroyed their lives in a matter of months. It makes rich people poor and poor people desperate. This man pawned his sister's car for some rock. His mother was his next victim.
She had just told me, look, I got these $300 or so for my eyes. I got to go get an operation tomorrow. I went home and took that money and went back and used again $200.
This is where they come back to, the base houses.
Base houses. I've seen girls come in there, sell their bodies, and do things that are incredible. I mean, things you couldn't even pay a hooker to do. But these girls, once they got on it, the guys in the house knew they could do whatever they wanted.
Police.
All right, once again, are these reports overblown?
When I first got here 6 months ago, I got a briefing on crack. My original estimate was this may be a fad that is being overblown. Since then, I have completely changed my mind. It is a drug that has almost taken over New York as the drug of choice, and I think the reasons that it has taken over New York are valid in the rest of the country. My personal estimate is we will, in the near future, see crack becoming one of the drugs of choice in the United States.
How long have you been an agent, and does anything compare to what you've seen here?
I've been a federal drug agent for 21 years, and I have never seen a drug phenomenon like this anywhere.
What do you mean?
I have never seen a drug so quickly become popular in across-the-board socioeconomic groups. This is a drug that started in the ghettos of Harlem, is now widely accepted in the poorest as well as the richest communities. We see kids from the most wealthy suburbs using it. We see kids from the poorest ghetto using it. We jokingly in our office say it's a drug that started on 145th Street and went to 42nd Street in 3 months. And 3 months after that, it went from 42nd Street to the entire Northeast.
Do we have any idea?
Jane, what could be done to stop the spread of those new drugs?
Well, Senator Lawton Chiles is trying to toughen up laws on these kinds of drugs, but everyone says law enforcement isn't the only answer. You have to make it socially unacceptable to use these drugs. And if people start dying from them, that might help. Cocaine deaths in Dade County have now jumped to about 2 a week.
And we just learned that basketball star Lynn Bias may have died from smoking cocaine. So I guess those addicts were very lucky.
They are, and I want to thank the people at Concept House in Village South, where those addicts are recovering, for all the help they gave us in this story.
Thank you for that story, Jane.
That's right. Say no to crack so you can live.
Be a winner. Stay off crack. For more information, call the state's toll-free number, 1-800-522-5353.
If you were a client and you came to my house and you started smoking, and for example, you had $500, I would make sure you wouldn't leave with a penny. And it wouldn't be hard to do it. Just that one hit, and I'll take every penny you got.
How do you live with yourself?
I cry all the way to the bank. Let's just say that.
There was another warning about cocaine today. Crack now has spread to almost every American city.
It is a problem in Houston, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Tucson, and Sacramento.
In the 1980s, the media sounded the alarm that a new drug, crack cocaine, was taking over American cities and that it had an especially devastating effect on pregnant women and their newborns.
A new study says that babies born to women who use cocaine during pregnancy are 3 times as likely to be born with birth defects.
They tend to be what we call jittery.
They're very, very high risk for cerebral palsy, mental retardation.
They are prone to hypertension, strokes, and sudden infant death syndrome.
These children, who are the most expensive babies ever born in America, are going to overwhelm every social service delivery system that they come in contact with throughout the rest of their lives.
Many of you may be thinking, well, drugs don't concern me, but it does concern you. It concerns us all because of the way it tears at our lives and because it's aimed at destroying the brightness and life of the sons and daughters of the United States. For 5 years, I've been traveling across the country, learning and listening, and one of the most hopeful signs I've seen is the building of an essential new awareness of how terrible and threatening drug abuse is to our society.
In 1982, to fight the smugglers here, the Reagan administration created the South Florida Task Force. But local officials say the federal effort is more talk than action. It is not stopping the flow of drugs. Art Nearboss of the Metro-Dade Police.
There is more cocaine available today than almost any time in our history.
We get a lot of tough talking about a war on drugs and the effort that's going to be put into it, and then on the other hand, we find that press release is not backed up by commitment.
And in a time of drastic budget cuts, there is nowhere near enough money to pay for the fight against drugs. The police are completely outnumbered.
On the Miami River, we get in approximately 5 or 6 ships per day. And if we check 2, that's a lot.
Police say they don't really know what percentage of the cocaine traffic they are stopping, but it's not much.
Last year, we seized about 50,000 pounds of cocaine here in Florida, which is double what we seized the previous year.
Record seizures every year. But the drug business is so profitable, and there is so little risk, that cocaine keeps getting cheaper and more pure.
I was at the meeting in California. He tried to testify 3 times. You guys haven't called him yet. Why? He has valuable information. These are the country guys. They're not going to tell you.
We are proceeding.
That he would conduct an investigation to investigate George Bush. And here's the evidence in this special report if anybody cares to find out what the truth is.
We understand the high level of emotional involvement, and we are prepared to allow some leeway to have you express yourselves, although this is not in accordance with the regular rules. We are prepared to listen to you. This meeting, Senator, the San Jose Mercury News identified a number of individuals as being involved in the drug trade and of having possible connections with the CIA, and we have proceeded to try to determine what the evidence is and what the facts are.
Convening this hearing and also making a public hearing.
West Los Angeles on the allegation of use of funds to support the Contras.
I would say that that all of this story, rather than about crack, is about crap. That's my crap. Yes. Rather than crack is crap. That's the way I look at it. It's a preposterous,
unfounded,
ridiculous.
I was at the meeting in California. He tried to testify 3 times. You guys haven't called him yet. Why? He has valuable information. These are the country guys.
More rip-offs. The savings and loan scandal could cost $500 billion. But in Washington, the big question still is who gets the blame. Today, the president and his congressional critics gave a preview of the positions that they'll be taking to the voters later this year. More on that now from NBC's John Cochran.
Trying to deflect charges that he has pussyfooted on SNL fraud, President Bush told federal prosecutors from all over the country to intensify their efforts.
We will not rest until the cheats and the chiselers and the charlatans spend a large chunk of their lives behind the bars of a federal prison.
Democrats, smelling blood on the SNL issue, accused Bush of using federal attorneys as props for a photo op.
And I don't know what it costs to fly all those U.S. attorneys in here, but I assume it cost a fair amount. I don't think they got a thing done.
Bush did promise to give prosecutors more help, including more investigators. Democrats fired back that the new Bush plan is a rehash of the one unveiled by his own Justice Department last December, which also called for more investigators.
The president told us today that he was going to hire 202 FBI agents. On December 7th, Attorney General Thornburg said on page 4 of his release a total of 202 FBI agents.
Democrats think the president is vulnerable partly because his son Neil is under investigation as a former director of a bankrupt thrift firm. Republicans say Democrats are desperate for an issue.
And some slick consultants believe it's the best way to proceed is to attack President Bush. And the best way to take on President Bush with a record-breaking popularity and a job approval rating is to somehow go after him on an SNL matter.
Both parties have suddenly discovered that voters are angry about the SNL fiasco and will be angrier if asked to pay for it with higher taxes. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
Savings and loan crisis is finally getting under the skin of some politicians. Congressmen who oversee the savings and loan industry have voted to spend $152 million next year to prosecute crooked SNL officials. That is $50 million more than President Bush wants to spend. As ABC's Stephen Ogg reports from Washington tonight, the politicians are clearly worried the public has discovered the SNL mess, and he's getting angry.
The handwriting was quite literally on the wall at a House Banking Subcommittee today, where everybody agreed that the people who looted the savings and loans ought to go to jail. But congressmen of both parties seem more worried about keeping their own jobs.
Doesn't make any difference who you are. But if you're running in a district and you have an opponent and you have a challenger, he is going to make issue out of the SNL scandal.
Annunzio ought to know. He's already under attack in his home district because he accepted campaign donations from Charles Keating, the former SNL executive who's been sued for fraud by the government. The ranking Republican said it's not the fault of Congress, it's the fault of states like Texas and California, whose banking regulations were not tough enough.
It may be that maybe some of the state legislatures in those states should be under more attack than the members of Congress seem to be on this issue.
The subcommittee had called in the Justice Department to complain that it's taking too long to prosecute those who caused the SNL mess. But the head of the department's criminal division disagreed. He said convicted SNL officials had been sentenced to a total of 381 years in prison.
200 defendants convicted, 306 defendants charged, fines imposed of almost $800,000.
Ironically, the big banner at the hearing room temporarily displaced a portrait of former committee chairman Fernand Saint-Germain. He was defeated 2 years ago amid allegations of improprieties involving savings and loans. Stephen Ogg, ABC News, Washington.
So the California commissioner got 200 applications to start new SNLs. Now remember, this is in a complete crisis. The industry is dying. It has enormous overcapacity. And 200 folks rushed to come into the industry. Why? Because they were almost all real estate developers. And they all wanted a cash cow. And every real estate developer's dream is to control a lending institution. The California commissioner said no to 0 of the 200 applications, even though they had enormous conflicts of interest. And it's no surprise that as a result of the savings and loan crisis, about 45% of total losses occurred in Texas.
Now, admirers of President Reagan might say, what's all this got to do with him? A lot of this happened at the state level.
Right, because he had no conception of what this would create as a dynamic, a competitive dynamic at the state level. And because the administration opposed our efforts to act against these incredibly permissive state environments.
So do you draw links then between this deregulatory culture and today? In other words, are the roots of this crisis to be found in Reagan's legacy?
To be fair to Reagan, the roots could be found far more, in the intellectual roots, in the Carter presidency. President Carter had far more substantive deregulation than did President Reagan. Carter famously deregulated large aspects of civil aviation and of trucking. As I said, President Reagan got maybe a 4 on the scale of deregulation. Carter had 10s on the scale of deregulation in some ways much bigger areas than savings and loans. Trucking and aviation affected everybody's lives all the time. Not everybody used a savings and loan, although all of us got to pay as taxpayers. So what happens next is the disaster. It's not that President Reagan kicked off the savings and loan crisis, it's that he made it vastly worse. Because savings and loans were recovering from the interest rate crisis as interest rates fell sharply through the 1980s. But by bringing in all these new real estate developers with conflicts of interest who were frequently fraudulent, this created a circumstance where pretty soon there were 300 of these savings and loans that were growing in an average rate of 50%. And this is what we clamped down on in what became known as re-regulation. And that was the greatest swear word the administration could use. Now, they weren't alone. The Democrats were heavily in favor of the deregulation of the savings and loan industry. The Garn-St. Germain Act passed the House and the Senate, in each case with only one dissenting vote. So both parties overwhelmingly supported this legislation. And when we started re-regulating, well, the Keating Five, 4 of those 5 senators that tried to prevent us from taking enforcement action against the largest violation of our rules we had ever found by Lincoln Savings, 4 of those senators were Democrats. The only Republican, of course, was John McCain. Speaker Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, a very powerful speaker, extorted our agency to try to get special favors for the second worst fraud in America in savings and loans. That was Vernon Savings, known to us regulators as Vermin. When we were finally able after this political opposition to close Vernon Savings, 96% of its loans were in default.
I guess that explains why the celebration of Ronald Reagan's economic policies is essentially a bipartisan affair.
Well, sadly, it is. This became the Reuben wing of the Democratic Party, which helped set the stage for the current crisis and is preventing, in the Obama administration, effective responses or sending any of the crooks to prison. Let me give you what the Reagan administration also did when we tried to crack down on these crises. This wave of fraud that we had documented. And again, we're making criminal referrals. People are starting to go to prison. We're bringing enforcement actions and civil actions and establishing widespread fraud. What was the reaction of the administration? It attempted to appoint and by the way, it attempted to do so on a recess appointment basis, which means there's no advice and consent of the Senate. 2 board members picked by Charles Keating. We only had, our agency was run by 3 board members, which means President Reagan's administration attempted to give Charles Keating majority control over the federal agency that was supposed to regulate savings and loans.
And just quickly remind everybody Keating's role in all this.
Keating was the most notorious of the frauds, even worse than Vernon Savings, but had exceptional political power because of his large contributions. So he was the person that was able to get a majority of the members of the House to co-sponsor a resolution telling us not to go forward with re-regulation. And by the way, most of the leadership of both parties in the House co-sponsored that resolution. If we had given in to that political pressure, those institutions would have continued, those frauds would have continued to grow at 50% a year, and you would have been dealing with not a $150 billion crisis, but a crisis well over $1 trillion.
Thanks very much for joining us, Bill.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.
The FBI says it found an organized crime informant who told the FBI about dealings with dozens of politicians in a number of states and in Washington, D.C. This is Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey, a Democrat. These pictures of Williams were made this morning outside the senator's house in Washington, while Williams was under FBI surveillance. Williams is one of more than 20 public officials from 5 states who have become targets of FBI Operation Abscam. Since last spring, on this quiet residential street in an expensive section of Washington, the FBI has been running what amounts to a sting operation on the Congress, and the sting operation has been elaborate. These pictures were made by NBC News with a special night vision camera. This townhouse was the scene of lavish parties thrown by undercover FBI agents who were posing as businessmen with Arab money backing. In the basement, behind a well-stocked wine rack, was the equivalent of a network TV control room. There was a chauffeur for the limousine, a butler and a maid, all undercover FBI agents. And this townhouse was just one of a number of locations where FBI agents are said to have paid out more than $1 million in bribes to influence members of Congress and other public officials. There were payoffs made elsewhere in the Washington area, at the Marriott Twin Bridges Motel in Arlington, Virginia. There were payoffs made on a yacht docked in Miami. And in New York City, undercover agents met with politicians at the Plaza Hotel to set up payoffs. Among those identified by federal investigators as targets of the operation are Congressman Michael Myers and Raymond Lederer of Philadelphia, Congressman John Jenrette of South Carolina, Congressman Frank Thompson Jr. of New Jersey, and Congressman John Murphy of New York, and another congressman from Florida who is unidentified. All are Democrats. None was available for comment. Tonight, FBI agents were seen entering the home of New Jersey Senator Harrison Williams. These pictures were made by NBC News with a special night lens. Sources say that more than 100 FBI agents today confronted the targets of Operation Abscam, telling them of the evidence against them. In the case of Senator Williams, federal investigators say the senator did not take cash directly, but instead was involved in promising to use his influence in conversations with the undercover FBI agents. After the FBI agents had left his home this evening, Senator Williams had this to say about the investigation.
Just a few minutes ago, 2 members of the FBI were here, and for the first time I learned about this and really don't know any of the facts of anything, and therefore I'm in no position to comment about what I don't know is happening at the department, but the department evidently has told you a lot more than they've told me.
You're not the target of an investigation, Senator? Can you say that you're not the target of an investigation?
Right now it appears that I am, and that's about all for now.
So far, no one has been indicted or convicted or even arrested. Today was just the windup of the undercover phase of the Abscam investigation. Later this month, prosecutors will present their evidence to federal grand juries in Washington and elsewhere.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Many of our fellow citizens apparently believe that your services were bought by Charles Keating, that you were bribed, that you sold your office, that you traded your honor and your good names for contributions and other benefits. Many of these same people also apparently believe that your action, and perhaps the actions of other senators and congressmen, were solely responsible for the saving and loan failures of scandalous proportions.
Lincoln's Savings was the worst, what we call in criminology, control fraud in the nation. That means a fraud run by the people who controlled the organization in this case Charles Keating, was looting the savings and loan. Keating was a not very effective real estate developer who was brought in to acquire Lincoln Savings and Loan by Michael Milken. Charles Keating was and is a very nasty, fraudulent guy. His reputation was, quote, for buying and selling politicians, unquote. One of the people on this list was then Representative McCain.
Of the 5 senators here before you, Senator McCain had the closest personal friendship with Charles Keating.
They were confidants, they were mutual political supporters. Of course, the money flowed one direction from Charles Keating to then Representative and eventually Senator McCain.
Over 3 campaigns, including his 1986 Senate campaign, John McCain received roughly $112,000 from Mr. Keating, ACC employees, and their families.
He was someone that McCain took much of his policy advice from on how you should regulate, or in this case, not regulate, savings and loans.
Senator McCain also was the only one who received personal as well as political benefits from Charles Keating.
The unique aspect of this relationship between Senator McCain and Charles Keating extended to the family. They're personal friends. Keating flies him down multiple times to the Bahamas at Keating's expense. Keating doesn't simply fly Senator McCain, he flies Senator McCain's wife as well, and the kids, and this one I really like, the babysitter, so that you can make it a real vacation.
In 1984 and 85, then Congressman McCain wrote several letters to Chairman Gray and White House officials urging them to postpone promulgation of the direct investment rule. Then Congressman McCain also supported a resolution to delay the rule. There is evidence that Senator McCain did so at the urging of Mr. Keating or other representatives of Lincoln.
Regulators had discovered that Keating had engaged in a massive violation of a key rule called the direct investment rule. And this rule restricted how much savings and loans could own in the way of real estate as opposed to making loans on it. The key to this rule was that direct investments were an ideal way to engage in accounting fraud. And accounting fraud is the weapon of choice of these kinds of corporate frauds. Keating had violated the direct investment rule by over $615 million, the largest violation in the history of the agency. And savings and loans that did significant amounts of direct investment always failed, and failed catastrophically.
I'm identifying for you what this case is that we are talking about. 1, several senators met with regulators about a pending enforcement matter involving a single company which had sued the bank board in the federal courts.
Keating has set up the meeting by recruiting 5 U.S. senators. And of course, all 5 of the senators received major political contributions from Charles Keating. The purpose of the meeting from Keating's standpoint is very clear because he puts it in writing. He wants us not to take any enforcement action against this violation of the direct investment rule. Effectively, he wants to immunize the worst violation in our history in an institution he's looting.
2, the senators did not have aides present, and more importantly, the chief regulator, Chairman Gray, was specifically directed not to bring aides with him.
This meeting was set up for deniability, and the idea was to have 5 U.S. senators there and only 1 regulator there. So there'd be the word of 5 U.S. senators against the 1 regulator with no aides to back him up.
3, Mr. Keating, on whose behalf the meeting was held, was a major political contributor to each of the senators who attended the meeting.
And that leads to the meeting precisely 1 week later with 4 of us from the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and all 5 U.S. senators. It was perceived as enormous pressure and designed to intimidate because that's exactly how Charles Keating set it up.
4, the regulators were asked to withdraw a duly promulgated regulation at the request of a single company and were told that the company would do certain things in return.
We are analogous to the police. Can you imagine someone coming to the police and saying, well, you caught these guys red-handed and they've committed this enormous crime, the biggest in your history, and you know that this kind of crime always leads to terrible, terrible harm to the public, but we don't want you to do anything because he's a big political contributor to us, so you shouldn't take any action. So we didn't think that they would have the nerve to try to do it again when there were actually witnesses. And in particular, we didn't think they would have the nerve because one of my jobs at the meeting was to take notes. And they do the same thing at the start of the meeting. Senator DeConcini says, we want you not to take enforcement action against the institution. And Senator DeConcini does it speaking on behalf of the group that he's hosting. And Senator McCain says nothing to distinguish himself or to say, no, that's not proper. Skip forward in time. After more direct political pressure set up by the Keating Five, the bank board stops all action to even find the facts against Lincoln Savings, even though it knows it's a criminal enterprise. Keating is allowed to stay open for an additional 2 years, which allows them to cause these massive losses of $3.4 billion. It produced the most expensive failure in U.S. history of a depository institution. Senator McCain knew the facts because we had briefed him. He knew this was a criminal enterprise. He knew that what was being done was improper. He knew how much undue political pressure, his words, or at least his words originally, was being brought to bear. He was uniquely in the position where he could have protested this and stopped it, stopped this loss, but he did nothing. And his statement is, once I figured out that Keating was not being abused, I no longer had any need to protect my constituent.
Monday, July 26th. Our top story tonight, illicit sex and possible blackmail. Those are the charges uncovered today by a New York State Senate investigation. Witnesses claim that a gay callboy network using children as young as 12 is selling sex to high officials in the nation's capital, then selling the information to Soviet, Israeli, and British agents. Here's a report.
Is that correct?
Dale Smith, an investigator who's worked for 5 years undercover for New York State's Legislative Committee on Crime, says an accountant for 5 callboy services in the Washington area told him the services make more money trafficking information than selling kiddie prostitution. He says while he was working undercover, he was approached by a KGB agent wanting to buy information on the service's government clients for the purpose of blackmail.
I was not personally debriefed by a foreign intelligence officer.
Were you questioned?
I have had contacts with foreign intelligence officers.
Detective Smith would not reveal which Washington officials were involved and what kind of blackmail the foreign agents had in mind. Also testifying 2 Washington detectives who helped develop the congressional page sex charges. They claim there is a network of callboy services linked to organized crime and spanning 6 major cities coast to coast.
You could call a phone number in Houston from Washington and have a young boy delivered to your room in Washington using an American Express card or another business card to charge it.
Dallas is one of the New York gay bars allegedly part of this callboy network.
The calls would be called into the bar. The boys would be waiting at the bar for their pickups.
Not true at all. That's ridiculous.
There's no one as young as 12 or 13 that hangs around at all?
Besides that, they haven't got any money to spend.
No, but they can be sold, is the allegation.
Not at all. No way.
Other alleged boy porno operations uncovered by Detective Smith: Haymarket and a gay bar called Follies, which has a branch in Washington. The committee is turning over its evidence to New York authorities and the Justice Department in Washington. In New York, Christy Fair, Independent Network News.
Also coming tonight, reports that Sudan will open its doors to the PLO fighters, and a man described by police as a John Hinckley-type loner is arrested after possibly planning to attack a nuclear power plant.
Also ahead, a military parachute jump ends in death, and a special report on the human mind, the power within.
In sports, highlights of the Yankees and the Tigers at the stadium.
And after an absolutely superb weekend, it looks as if our weather will settle down to a touch of mediocrity. Details straight ahead.
The Challenge, it's an action thriller with samurai fighters, and I'll have my review.
We will also show you an emotional reunion between a Hungarian couple and the baby they had not seen for more than a year. And finally, how are those 3D movies made anyway? These stories more coming up in the next hour here on Independent Network News.
Contractors, civilian employees, intelligence officials, something of that nature. And a lot of these communications were related to picking up underage
Nonetheless,
prostitutes.
the decision ultimately was made to hand over the records to a responsible media outlet, in this case, ABC News in New York, without compensation and/or promises or guarantees of any sort. Even though ABC News is under no obligation whatsoever to me, I do expect their reporting to help identify potential witnesses for my defense. For me, this is an absolute necessity, since the government has placed me in the untenable position whereby I do not have sufficient monies to undertake this extraordinarily expensive task. Consequently, I would ask the press and the media to put aside the titillation of the who's who's list, at least in part, and instead investigate the disturbing genesis, the confounding evolution, and the equally alarming continuation of this matter. I believe there is something very, very rotten at the core of my circumstance, and without money to hire my own investigators, I must rely upon your acumen and talent here in the press and the media to uncover the truth.
I've had the story for 3 years. I've had this interview with Virginia Roberts. We would not put it on the air. First of all, I was told, who's Jeffrey Epstein? No one knows who that is. This is a stupid story. Then the palace found out that we had her whole allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us a million different ways. We were so afraid we wouldn't be able to interview Kate and Will that also quashed the story. And then Alan Dershowitz was also implicated in it because of the planes. She told me everything. She had pictures. She had everything. She was in hiding for 12 years. We convinced her to come out. We convinced her to talk to us. It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton, we had everything. I tried for 3 years to get it on, to no avail, and now it's all coming out, and it's like these new revelations, and I freaking had all of it. I'm so pissed right now. Like, every day I get more and more pissed because I'm just like, oh my God, what we had was unreal. Other women backing it up. Hey, yep. Brad Edwards, the attorney, 3 years ago, saying there will come a day when we will realize Jeffrey Epstein was the most prolific pedophile this country has ever known. And I had it all 3 years ago.
Pentagon porn story began in 2006. An Immigration and Customs Enforcement child pornography sting operation called Project Flicker produced payment records of about 5,200 people, many of whom provided Army or fleet zip codes or military email addresses. Subsequently, the Pentagon's investigative branch, DCIS, began going through the ICE list to identify who actually was a DoD employee or a contractor. The investigation, however, only ran for 8 months and only cross-checked some 3,500 names for Pentagon ties, according to a senator. According to DCIS documents revealed in a Freedom of Information Act request, out of that 3,500, investigators uncovered 264 employees or contractors, including staffers for the Secretary of Defense and contractors at the NSA. 9 people had top security clearances. but only about 20% of those 264 people were completely investigated. Fewer still were prosecuted, and after about 8 months, the entire probe was halted. It left about 1,700 names totally unchecked, 1,700 alleged kiddie porn customers, an unknown number of whom may still work in some capacity for the Defense Department.
But, you know, you don't look at Denny Hastert and think Northern Illinois University. You don't look at him and think, you know, the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. You look at him and think U.S. House of Representatives. He was the longest-serving Republican speaker in U.S. history. But so far as the U.S. House of Representatives is concerned, they, as an institution, have done nothing to distance themselves from Denny Hastert, other than taking down his picture. Literally, they took his portrait down in the hall, and that's it. The U.S. House of Representatives has the ability to censure both its members and its former members if they want to. It's not an everyday thing. Last time a former House member was censured was in the 19th century. It doesn't happen often. But then neither does Denny Hastert. He's the highest-ranking American elected official to have ever been sentenced to prison. He's the only high-ranking American official to have been sentenced to prison after admitting in open court to being a serial child molester. This Denny Hastert thing is not a run-of-the-mill former member of Congress gone bad thing. He was the longest-serving ever Republican Speaker of the House, and it was not that long ago that he was Speaker. But since he has been convicted and sentenced to prison and given a report date, even as all these other institutions in the country have taken steps to disassociate themselves from him and make clear where they stand in relation to Denny Hastert, Congress, the House of Representatives, has said beep, nothing, no reprimand, no censure. Are they really just going to let this go?
Were Deutsche Bank and J.P. Morgan bigwigs complicit in Jeffrey Epstein's abuse of young women? The attorney for Epstein's accusers make that claim in new legal filings. I'm Anjanette Levy, and welcome to Law and Crime Sidebar Podcast. The saga involving Jeffrey Epstein, it just seems like it's never, ever going away. Jeffrey Epstein, of course, is the convicted sex offender, but also a multimillionaire, maybe even a billionaire, who was accused by many women of treating them as sex slaves. So joining me to talk about these new claims being made in legal filings by the accusers of Jeffrey Epstein is Adam Klasfeld. He's the managing editor of lawandcrime.com and also the host of the Objections podcast produced by Law and Crime. So Adam, welcome back to Sidebar. Thanks for coming on. These are some pretty explosive allegations, but maybe not totally surprising if you've been following this case because, you know, Jeffrey Epstein is somebody who mingled with royalty, who mingled with former presidents. So it's not shocking for us to hear that possibly there were bigwigs with these big banks who may have known about what was going on with him.
At 6:32, breaking overnight, an FBI raid with big implications for a Florida doctor, and this investigation centers on West Palm Beach, but we're learning of alleged ties to senators. Katie Johnson has more from the scene.
Well, we are right outside of the Vitreoretinal Consultants Eye Center here in West Palm Beach, which belongs to Dr. Salomon Melgen. According to the Miami Herald, Melgen owes the IRS millions of dollars, despite the fact that he donated hundreds of thousands to several politicians. FBI agents came here late last night and worked into the morning, searching through the office and taking away potential evidence. According to the Miami Herald, Dr. Melgen has an outstanding lien of more than $11 million to the IRS. But the report shows Melgen also donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to politicians. The doctor is also accused of providing Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey with underage prostitutes while on free trips to the Dominican Republic. Now, FBI agents at the scene overnight did not talk to any reporters, but we will be sure to check in with them later on this morning and today on this developing story. For ABC Action News, I'm Katie Johnson.
According to former New Jersey Boy Scout John Humphrey, that trouble started in 1972, just 12 years old, when he says his scoutmaster abused him.
I was abused over a period of 3 years, probably well over 200 times by my scoutmaster, who was also my assistant principal, my band leader, my soccer coach, and had unfettered access to me. So I stuffed it away in a place, and I never talked to anybody about it.
A painful secret he says he kept to himself until 2017.
It changes your life when you come out. I mean, it's cost me a job, income, a difficulty to maintain employment, either because you get some domineering boss and you just want to tell them to jump in a lake, or you can't stay focused.
Now John is sharing his story in the harrowing new documentary on Hulu, Leave No Trace, a hidden history of the Boy Scouts.
Parents gave the Boy Scouts the most valuable thing they had, their children.
Shining a light on survivors of sexual abuse and a century-long scandal inside the Boy Scouts of America, the organization concealing that there were pedophiles in their ranks.
When the detective says he confessed to abusing you, I must have read the email 100 times.
Even with all that has been known about the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandals, today's revelations about the historical role of Pope John Paul II in the elevation of a former archbishop accused of sexual abuse was stunning. A report from the Vatican found two popes either ignored, overlooked, or downplayed allegations when it came to taking tough action against Theodore McCarrick over 2 decades. Amna Nawaz has the story.
Judy, the 449-page report found that before John Paul II elevated Theodore McCarrick to Archbishop of Washington, he already was aware of multiple allegations against McCarrick. That included reports of sexual misconduct with another priest, sharing beds with seminarians, and anonymous letters accusing him of pedophilia with his nephews. But McCarrick denied those allegations, and he rose to become one of the most powerful and well-known Catholic leaders in the United States. The investigation also found that Pope Benedict delayed an investigation into McCarrick's behavior, and that Pope Francis also did not act on allegations about McCarrick until 2017, believing that Pope John Paul II had already reviewed them. McCarrick was removed as Archbishop in 2006, but wasn't defrocked, that is to say removed from the church, until 2019.
Latest now on former Subway spokesman Jared Fogle, expected to plead guilty to charges of possessing child pornography. ABC's Alex Perez is in Indianapolis with the details. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, George. Details is still developing, but the U.S. attorney could be here at the courthouse discussing possible charges in this case a little bit later today.
Hi, I'm Jared, the Subway guy.
Overnight, ABC News confirming Jared, the Subway guy Fogle, is expected to plead guilty to charges related to a child porn investigation. Subway quickly severing ties with Fogle following the news, tweeting, "We no longer have a relationship with Jared and have no further comment."
Gymnastics scandal. A longtime Team USA doctor now charged with sexual abuse, allegedly targeting multiple young gymnasts. And ABC's Paula Ferris is here with that story. Good morning, Paula.
Good morning to you, Amy. These sexual assault charges are rocking the gymnastics world. Larry Nassar was Team USA's doctor in 4 Olympics, treating the sport's biggest stars. And now the former Michigan State doctor is being called a monster and could spend the rest of his life behind bars. This morning, Larry Nassar, a top sports doctor who treated Olympic athletes, is facing 22 criminal charges of sexual abuse.
Young women athletes who came to him for medical treatment. Instead, Dr. Nassar preyed on these young girls.
Joining us to discuss this, investigative journalist Ben Swan. So Ben, the Pentagon already takes measures to limit worker access to stuff like porn by rolling out what they call the personal electronic device PED policy, where workers have to drop off their phones and lockers before entering their offices. All their online searches are accessible by security if or when needed. Their Wi-Fi access is monitored in digital security sweeps. So how is this happening?
Well, it's happening because even though there is a certain amount of limitation on access, those who are working in the Department of Defense, clearly it appears to be thousands of individuals in the Department of Defense, are finding ways around this, specifically by using the Department of Defense IP addresses and also apparently peer-to-peer sharing within the department's network. So this study that was done on this issue, and it is pretty horrifying, Manila, to consider this. It shows that the Department of Defense ranked 19th out of almost 3,000 networks in terms of peer-to-peer sharing of child pornography. That is absolutely incredible. This bill attempts to essentially say, look, we're not doing enough to stop it from coming in, but we're also not doing enough in the Department of Defense to go after those individuals who are being recognized as the ones who were perpetrating this.
So Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger is the co-author to this bill. She said this, quote, "The notion that the Department of Defense's network and Pentagon-issued computers may be used to view, create, or circulate such horrifying images is a shameful disgrace and one we must fight head-on."
Mr. President, the senator from Illinois says that Congress hasn't acted in 2 decades. That's true. I haven't been here for 2 decades. He has. There is no excuse to not take action now. There is no excuse to not act on this problem when we know what the solution is. So listen, if the senator is saying today, if he's committing today to holding hearings and marking up a bill to toughen the child pornography laws, to make mandatory the sentencing guidelines, that's fantastic. I'll take him at his word. I look forward to seeing those hearings noticed and to seeing that markup noticed. And I hope it'll be forthcoming. I'm here to make a prediction. I think we'll be waiting a very long time. Because let's not forget.
You don't look at Denny Hastert and think Northern Illinois University. You don't look at him and think, the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. You look at him and think U.S. House of Representatives. He was the longest serving Republican speaker in U.S. history. But so far as the U.S. House of Representatives is concerned, they, as an institution, have done nothing to distance themselves from Denny Hastert, other than taking down his picture. Literally, they took his portrait down in the hall, and that's it. The U.S. House of Representatives has the ability to censure both its members and its former members if they want to. It's not an everyday thing. Last time a former House member was censured was in the 19th century. It doesn't happen often. But then neither does Denny Hastert. He's the highest-ranking American elected official to have ever been sentenced to prison. He's the only high-ranking American official to have been sentenced to prison after admitting in open court to being a serial child molester. This Denny Hastert thing is not a run-of-the-mill former member of Congress gone bad thing. He was the longest-serving ever Republican Speaker of the House, and it was not that long ago that he was Speaker. But since he has been convicted and sentenced to prison and given a report date, even as all these other institutions in the country have taken steps to disassociate themselves from him and make clear where they stand in relation to Denny Hastert, Congress, the House of Representatives, has said beep, nothing, no reprimand, no censure. Are they really just going to let this go?